Maria, I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, I know when people are entering the waiting room, there's alarms, like there's a sound that's made. And can we just turn off the pop-ups for now and the notifications, I guess, because I think it's a little bit, at least for me, it's who is very, very distractible. Um, it is
I've done
distracting.
that, inshallah. No problem.
Okay. All right. So as long as everyone there is in the position they want to be right now, I'll begin then. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. I am so happy to be here today with our partners from the UK. Sacred, just a fantastic organization. Um, it's wonderful to be here this morning, although I'm not a morning person. We are early. I don't think anyone's seen me up this early before of my friends and students. But it is really great to be here with so many old friends, students, community, servants of God who are servants of the community. And I'm looking forward to learning today from many others. Uh, what I'm going to do today, we have so much we could talk about, but I wanted to, Mihad and I, my research partner Mihad and I wanted to give you this morning a bit of an overview of our journey through the Hurma Project and identify, rather than go very deeply into the research, identify for you what our intention has been. Intention is a very important concept in Islamic theology and spirituality. So, what our intention has been, what we have learned along the way that has made us shift some of the things that we do, and where we think some big questions still remain. And anyone who wants to learn more about the Hurma Project can go to our website, can go to the research papers, the podcast, the other things that you may find there. So to begin, I'm going to just share a few slides, and I'm not going to put it in presentation mode. You're going to see some things along the slide, but that's because I found that in Zoom meetings, as soon as you put in presentation mode, some very strange things happen in the room. So as long as maybe Maria, you can just let me know. Can you can see my slides? As long as everyone's saying yes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. So what is the Hurma Project? The Hurma Project is a research and education project. We are not an organization. We never intended to be a permanent fixture on the scene. We have a fiscal sponsor, which is my university. I teach at Huron University College in London, Ontario, Canada. So that is our fiscal sponsor and the way that we're able to receive financial support from the Muslim community, which has been the sole supporter of our project. There's two reasons why we never wanted to establish an organization. The first is because we have been approaching this as researchers and as educators who have tried to bring what we can contribute to the discussion, to learning, to this topic. So I am a professor. My focus is in Islamic studies, more specifically, studying the Quran, Islamic law, and Islamic ethics. Mihad Fahmy is a lawyer who is also an investigator, so who uses her expertise to engage in workplace investigations, so investigations of human rights violations and other forms of human rights violations. And she also engages in mediation. At the same time, both of us are longstanding active participants in many Muslim community organizations. We are both members and leaders in various organizations and have been over a number of decades. So we approach this through our lived experience with Muslim communities and in the institutions and organizations that that we are members of and that we have served in leadership positions from time to time. The other reason for us why we do not want to shift to a organization just dedicated to this topic is that as we contribute what we can, which is our knowledge, our experience, some models for training, engagement, cultural shift. In the end, after all of this learning, the obligation really falls upon each community, each what we call a Muslim space. So a Muslim space is any organization, a mosque, a school, a third space. Muslim spaces also encompass family homes where people are in community with each other in some form of community as Muslims. Okay. And in a Muslim space, then the any language associated with Islam, any Islamic terms or knowledge or concepts that are being invoked will have particular resonance and power and authority. So as people come together as Muslims, they are elevating the authority of this Islamic knowledge, terminology, and practices. That gives them the great power to do good and also to be co-opted and used in a nefarious and harmful way by some others. So the shift really has to be ultimately the shift in responsibility goes to all of those who are present in Muslim spaces, with a particular burden placed on those who are identified, even if they aren't formally trained or if they don't have formal titles, but those among them who have chosen to accept a position as the more knowledgeable, the more authoritative, the one who has a particular status or position. Those people have an extra responsibility that comes along with that form of leadership, power, and influence. And that responsibility is to make sure that this recognition that they have is not being used, that they do not use it in a way that enables or abuse and exploitation of others. So when we began this project way back in 2018, and it's hard to imagine that this is 8 years on now, we have been engaged in slow research, like the slow food movement. We believe that learning and digesting and just being together is a form of acquiring resilience. It is really spending time in relationship with others, with community members, with our research partners, with those who we consult with, but also holding this knowledge, sharing it with others, and allowing everyone time to think about it, digest it, reflect upon it, and give us feedback, engage with it at their own pace. This is what ultimately we believe will enable anything we do to have some staying power, to be really part of truly a community project rather than something that we're simply imposing because we are experts. And that's something that we've been resisting the whole way, because we do believe that the exaggeration in the status of scholars or people who have knowledge, expertise, people who have some sort of position of leadership, we believe that the exaggeration of those people's worth over the worth of others, their importance over the importance of others, is at the root one of the main problems of exploitation. It is this idea that some people are more valuable than others. Some people deserve more respect. Some people deserve to be considered immune from error, or if not theologically immune from error, at least they're treated that way. They're treated in some ways as untouchable. And so we're really trying to offer what we have, but not position ourselves in any way as a solution. So the project itself, this is what we say our mission is, that we aim to uphold the Hurma, which is the sacred inviolability of those present in Muslim spaces, whether they're Muslim or are not Muslim, from abuse and exploitation by those holding religious knowledge, power, and authority. So those are some of the key aspects of what we do. Now, this word Hurma is important to us because it is rooted in a very important teaching of the Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, who is our role model of how to live the values of Islam among people. So we have the Quran, which is God's revelation, which is the core of our knowledge of who God is, what God wants from us. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the one who embodied those principles and values of the Quran and those goals of the Quran, along with others. So we really turn to his example as our example. And so this term Hurma comes out, and he's referred to it in a number of different places, but we're particularly struck by this teaching where he was engaging in a dialogue with one of his companions on the most holy day of the year in a place that is a very holy. So the Prophet Muhammad asked his companion about the time, and asked, isn't this the day of sacrificing the animals, which comes right after the end of the Hajj? And this was in the month of the Hajj, which is also known as a sacred month. So there are certain actions that are impermissible in the sacred month because it is sacred. So this idea that is sacred and certain things that are sacred, and all of this is to recognize that it is God who is our creator. Any sacrifice is not for the sake of a human being or because God needs us, but because it means we understand that everything we have in this life, in this created world, of which we are a part of the community of creation, comes from our creator. And that we are servants of God. We are subject to God's command as everything else in creation is. But we have this extra obligation that the rest of creation does not have, which is to enact justice among ourselves and to do what is right and stop what is wrong on the earth. That is the special remit of humanity, is our moral obligation as a collectivity, as a group of human beings, to on this earth, do what we can to bring justice and fairness and what is right, and to promote benefits and to prevent harms among ourselves. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is asking his companion about what this special day is. And he uses that as a device to say then, once the person is centered on thinking about how sacred this day is, that he's with the Prophet Muhammad. He's thinking about the sacrality of the time. So they've created this heightened emphasis on the sacred time. Then the Prophet Muhammad says, indeed, your blood, your property, and your honor are inviolable to one another, like this sacred inviolability, this hurma of this day of yours, in this month of yours, and in this city of yours. And the city, of course, is Mecca. Mecca is the place where we go for the Hajj. It is incumbent upon those who are present to inform those who are absent, because those who are absent might comprehend this better than those present. So the major learning and then the secondary learning. So the major learning is that if we think about the human being, I think about the person, the human person, and the space that we're taking up as embodied people, and how we're moving, right, among other created things, to think of us in a way as an analogy to the sacred city of Mecca during the sacred time. That is a really deep and profound concept. And if we hold that in imagination, we think we can then question ourselves, do I treat other people with the same honor that I treat this holy place and this holy time? What would be required of me to really elevate that? And if we hold up what we believe about human beings, each human being, then we can compare anything else that happens to that concept. Does this uphold their hurma? Am I treating them as that human being created with this sacrality, divinely endowed sacrality? And if not, then something's wrong. So that rather than beginning with what we're fighting against, we're really thinking about what we're fighting for, what we are fighting for in our own behavior and as a community together. And then the second part, informing those who are absent, this is where we understand our duty and obligation, that when we do understand something, or when we learn something, even if we don't understand it, because informing, what's interesting here is the word inform really means to tell people about it. So we don't own this concept. We don't, we aren't the ultimate interpreters of this. We are the transmitters. We're the ones who are sharing this teaching and struggling to do our best to implement it within our lives. But the understanding, the implementation is the community responsibility and also the community right. And that goes back to a key point that we have in our work together. And one of the reasons why, when we have seen anyone who claims religious authority or status, and I'll give some examples, if we see them using their position or their knowledge to abuse other people, it is really very offensive to us, because we do not believe that any human being has been created by God as better than another human, that they have some kind of status that makes them untouchable. This is our view of Tawheed, which is that it is only God, the Creator, who has true knowledge, the true knowledge of things, and that the rest of us are created human beings who have a duty and obligation to understand, to accept and try to understand, but who none of us can claim to have that elevated status above others. So when we see some claiming that their knowledge makes it possible for them to engage in abuse of others, and using Islamic terms, this is very offensive. So I'm going to give a few examples of the kind of things that over our lives, Mihad and I have encountered. And the reason why we have encountered them is the reality that in many cases of abuse, people have gone to other people who they believed, because of their position of leadership or authority in an institution, would have addressed this or would have been equally shocked and would have done anything they could to make sure that there was accountability for the abuse that happened. But again and again, they found that they were disbelieved or ignored, or what happened to them was minimized. And so then people would go and look around. Is there someone who could understand me? Is there someone who will listen to me? And in most cases, most of the disclosures that we've heard before we launched this project really came about that way. Sometimes they came about when we were in a position of leadership within a community, but often it was just because those who had had their rights violated were just turning around and finding that they were being disbelieved, they were being denied. What happened to them was being minimized, and they were hoping that there was someone, and if anyone who had, in their estimation, some kind of knowledge or influence, maybe we could influence someone in their institution, they would turn to us. So I just want to give you some real life, obviously anonymized examples of the kind of things we've seen. And I realized that mentioning these, even though they're anonymized examples, might be a little bit difficult for people, especially for any survivor who has experienced one of these scenarios. So I just want to warn you about that and say, of course, you can mute me or turn away from the screen. But I just want to briefly mention the range of scenarios that we're talking about. So, for example, all too often, hearing about a sheikh, and a sheikh is a term of respect. It literally means elder in Arabic, but it is a term that is then used or was acquired by the Islamic tradition to mean someone who has that kind of who's considered to be a spiritual elder or someone who has knowledge. So they even could be very young, but there's still the term sheikh is applied to them. Could also be the leader of a tribe or a leader of a state. So some of the Gulf states, the head of the state is called sheikh so and so, and that's because they're the head of some tribe or family. So, but as a religious term, it's a very common term of respect that people's followers give to their teacher, their spiritual teacher or leader, or that person might just give to him or herself. So sheikh is the masculine, sheikha is the feminine term. So a sheikh who claims special exemption from the sacred law to touch opposite gender murids. Murid is a term for a follower, a spiritual student, who's in this special relationship of spiritual coaching. So a sheikh might claim that they have special exemption from the law to touch opposite gender murids for spiritual healing, or to touch the aura, meaning the private areas of the private parts of the body of murids of any gender. So that's an example of using religious terms or concepts such as spiritual healing, and using a status such as one's status as a spiritual leader to violate the sacred law. And also that violation of the sacred law is also an example of abuse, sexual abuse. Another example is the sheikha, the female spiritual guide who demands control over a student's entire life, belittling her and questioning her faith when she shares her desire to spend more time with her family. So this would be, the student now is experiencing emotional abuse. Also, she is having damage to the relationship that she has with her family because of her spiritual teacher's demands. Another example is is an interesting one because it shows that religious leaders themselves can be spiritually abused by those who have a certain kind of power over them. So another example would be the chair of a mosque board demanding limitless sacrifice of an imam, saying, you are working for Islam, and if you're sincere, you would not ask for a raise or for time off. So here, the chair of the board of the mosque, who holds the purse strings, right, and holds the ability to hire and fire people, is financially abusing the imam, underpaying them, overworking them, and using this religious concept of sincerity, of having a good intention, right, in their intention for the work. So misusing that, so using their power and misusing a religious concept to financially abuse the imam and create like a work violate their rights as someone who is who's working for the community. We have a few other examples. So this could be the imam who breaks confidentiality and puts a young person in danger by informing their parents about a sensitive issue for which they sought counseling. And this is a violation of the confidentiality that should be held within a spiritual counseling session. So maybe the young person has spoken with the imam about their struggles with sexuality. Their parents are trying to force them to marry, and they are not attracted to the opposite gender. Or maybe this young person has struggles with their faith and is going for some spiritual counseling. But now the imam breaks that trust, the amana, the trust between them, and puts them in some kind of danger. The reason they didn't go to their parents is because their parents might kick them out of the house, or their parents might physically abuse them or emotionally abuse them. So in this way, the imam has caused a harm and violated the trust of their office. We have other examples like the Hifz tutor, who can, even within the home, um, uh, engage in sexual molestation of young students they're teaching. And one of the enablers of this situation is the idea that is often taught within Muslim communities that gender segregation is the best way to prevent sexual abuse. So the idea that that because this is a man and he's tutoring a male student, that there's no possibility of any problem. They can be left alone. A vulnerable child could be left alone with an adult. Whereas we know that obviously that's not the case, that sexual abuse is not the result of sexual attraction, and therefore gender segregation does not is not a protection against that, or the idea that that people's desire to engage in abuse is in some way related to a kind of normative sexuality. Okay, and then finally, an example of a popular preacher who proposes secret marriage to a new convert seeking advice. So this is the predation of the powerful and the vulnerable, and this can be rationalized with selective and legalistic approaches to Islam, ignoring other religious and professional norms. So these are the kind of things that scenarios that we see. So what happens then with this? Why when there are these very clear violations, have they not been followed up? Have they not been investigated? Has there been no accountability? And I'm going to go on for another probably 5 minutes and then turn it over to Mihad. Is that the reason why those who should be holding others accountable have not been is they're using, again, both the violator, the abuser, the predator, the person who has caused the harm, and or those who are responsible for holding them accountable misuse other religious concepts to justify their failure to investigate or to hold accountable. So they will use the concept of sitr, which is a valid concept in Islam of covering up sins, and the idea of private accountability, muhasaba. So we agree with this teaching for private sins where someone is violating a so-called right of God and not a right of a person. So engaging in abuse is a violation of a right of person, not a violation of the right of God. But if someone violates the right of God, say, because in Islam, drinking alcohol is prohibited, so this is a violation of the right of God, or other failures to comply with ritual law, Islamic ritual law, or to avoid other forms of unlawful but illicit behavior, they can engage in private repentance, and anyone who knows about it, their right is that they should cover up, because this is between this person, cover up in the sense of not disclose. It's not an act of covering up, but it is failing to disclose because this is between them and God. And they should be engaging in an act of personal repentance. Now, if they violate the right of another, then we shift the violation of the right of a person. Then the person who has been harmed has the right to a truthful account. They have a right to an application of justice that is focused on their needs and interests. And any witness to this violation should be prepared to testify to what they've witnessed if requested. Now, if this is an interpersonal violation where the public interest isn't violated, then the harmed party may choose to keep the matter private to a reasonable extent. They have the right to do that. But this is, again, the person who has been harmed controls this. However, what happens when it's someone who is the person who's committed the violation is a position of public trust, which is known as an amana? Well, then this person is subject to public accountability, which is related to that earlier term that I invoked, muhasaba, which is personal accountability. But in this case, there's public accountability, which is hisba. These two words come from the same root, but they have very different meanings. Who has the responsibility for public accountability? Well, this is the collective duty, the fard kifaya of the Muslim community to uphold justice among themselves. So it depends what level we're talking about. This could be a matter of, of the state, or it could be a matter of a small community identifying who is the leader among them, who's responsible for that. Or they could have a committee in their small community organization, a committee that is given the authority to uphold justice among them if this happens. But the issue is that there is a requirement of public accountability when there is someone who holds the public trust. And the importance of this, and the reason why we're focused on this, no matter what jurisdiction this is that in all of the anecdotes and all of the scenarios that we talked about, is this truth that we know is that when a person's hurma is violated by someone in a position of religious leadership, authority, or trust, the harm they experienced is amplified. The person's relationship with Islam, with the religion, and even with God may be negatively impacted. So whether the abuse is emotional, physical, financial, when it happens within this context, there's the additional harm of spiritual abuse. We also believe that so this is a kind of accompaniment or amplification of the original harm based on the context. We also talk about spiritual harm that is direct, and that's really where someone, and this happens most often in groups that, for lack of a better word, we could say are cultish in their behavior, that exaggerate the special status of a spiritual leader, and everyone is required to be in a situation or a posture of complete obedience to that leader. That in that case, there's a dynamic of direct spiritual harm where the predator or the abuser is directly targeting the person's ability for their own moral and spiritual discernment. And that's a whole nother conversation we can talk about another time. But just to understand that that is what we'll call direct spiritual harm, and really can often take the longest to heal from, because it affects very much the sense of self and the person's own relationship with God. They've really directly tried to interfere and take away the reverence and obedience that's due to God and shift it to themselves. And so that is probably the most harmful. So these are just some of the uh, findings that we have, and the reason why we focus on the use and misuse of Islamic concepts and status. So with that, we then also look at situations of, well, what should happen if any of these forms of abuse or harm happen. And here we have developed various pedagogies, and I'm going to turn it over to Mihad just to identify some of the things that we're working on. And she's specifically working on very closely in that area.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Matson, and thank you to our friends at Sacred. I'm really so very grateful to be here and spend the day with all of you today. So Dr. Matson has walked us through some of the principles that have guided our work. And I think I can very comfortably attest to this being, as she put it, a slow, I like that analogy, a slow cooking kind of movement. Under her leadership really has encouraged us to take the time to learn first, digest, and then look for feedback. And so part of today is also part of that process for us is to continue our learning and to continue receiving feedback. So what I want to do with the time remaining is reflect on one aspect of our work that we're immersed in at this very moment, and that is to how do we provide communities with resources that are relevant, practical, and accessible. So over the course of the last 8 years, and I honestly cannot believe that it has been 8 years, but it has, I searched my inbox to our first meeting, and it was in fact in 2018. And so over the course of the last 8 years, I noticed a couple of different reactions from people. And by people, I mean our brothers and sisters in Muslim communities, when I share the idea behind the work of the Hurma Project. There are those who kind of nod, knowingly, but don't really say much else. There are those who actively ask, how can we learn more? I'll direct them to the website as we develop the website and, of course, the podcast series. Some automatically assume that we are another organization, which we are not, as Dr. Matson pointed out. And they assume that we are accepting and investigating complaints, probably because of my own positionality or my own work. So they assume that this is, the purpose behind the project, which it is not. And others have tried to kind of connect the dots and between the work and one particular case or another. And of course, there are many, many other responses, and I'm sure our friends at Sacred, can add to that list. But the reaction that I wanted to reflect on with you this morning is that of relief. So we've been told time and again that the work is necessary, that we are, as communities, struggling and don't know how to handle such sensitive issues, and that we, communities, are need resources. But usually what they mean by that is they want some kind of how to, right? The people in this category, they want answers. They recognize that there's a problem and they simply want to know what to do about it. And so they're looking to us to provide those answers. And as a lawyer, this sentiment really is not unfamiliar to me because clients, of course, they want to know your opinion, but at the end of the day, they want you to tell them what you think they should do based on the law. And the common joke about lawyers saying it depends is not the answer that they want to hear. But nevertheless, it's often the legally sound one and the responsible one to give. And so, what kind of answers can we provide communities when it comes to preventing and responding to spiritual abuse and harm? One of our objectives is capacity building and providing communities with an understanding of the multifaceted and layered issue of spiritual abuse and harm, and of course, helping equip them with tools for prevention, response, and restoration. And so one of the ways that we are doing this is through the development of case studies, which will, inshallah, be included in our handbook. And I've been thinking about that term handbook and how it relates to expectations. But again, that's something that we will have to consider. So the case study method as a teaching tool is what I know best because it's how legal principles were taught in law school. And I use the same method in my own teaching to non-law students in a course that I teach at Huron College, Freedom of Religion and Religious Accommodation. So I understand the value of using this as a method for understanding and applying principles. And the idea behind the case method is to develop a fictional scenario with sufficient depth and layers for the student to identify, not too easily, but to identify the relevant issues and then work through the analysis. And from the instructor's point of view, it's both a creative and an analytical exercise. You want the characters, the dynamics, the kind of plot to be realistic, right? Like you want it to hold together. And you also want to embed the relevant issues in a way that's not too obvious and tests the student's understanding of the concepts being taught. But as we developed our case studies for the handbook, we're confronted with the very wide and deep diversity across our communities. So take a moment and consider your community, your own community, whatever that might be. Consider its stage of development, its members' immigrant status, the racial and class makeup of the congregation, the racial and class status of the religious leadership, of the board, even if one exists, life experiences, local politics, resources, and the list goes on. And I'd bet that it differs in some respect to others in this room. And in developing the case studies, the issue we face, in my opinion, is not so much about representation as it is about relevance. And what I mean by this is that, yes, it's important for people to see themselves in the case study, right? Like you want the reader to be able to recognize their community, at least in one of them, and therefore to engage in the material a little bit more intimately than if it were a remote or unfamiliar fact scenario. But even more important is the question of whether the analysis, including, and probably most importantly, our proposed course of action, is that applicable to the reader and their community? And this is where things become difficult, because not all community responses that we offer will be useful to all communities. And the most obvious example is that of investigations. So, from our early days of our work, we have been advocating and talking about the importance of conducting neutral third-party investigations and the importance of the process being fair and following best practices. Now, we know very well that many communities do not have the resources to hire a third-party investigator to conduct the process. But does that mean that we don't make this recommendation? I don't think so, because it continues to be best practice. At the same time, we can't recommend that untrained communities carry out their own process, because this could cause further harm. So what do we tell communities to do instead? And do we tell communities to do anything instead? Again, the answer is no, because we don't have the answers. We don't have all the answers. And so this brings me back to the reaction of relief, the kind of finally somebody's doing this, tell us what to do kind of response. And I think what I've come to understand is that this is not the focus of our work. And yes, sometimes the answer is it depends. And more often than not, the answer is here are the issues you should consider when you're devising your course of action. Here are the questions about power and consent you should ask yourself. This is what you need to understand about healthy boundaries and about fairness. But we can't give you a formula because we don't know your community. You know your community. And this is something that Dr. Matson started with in her presentation. And so instead of this being a handbook of resources that will include a checklist or templates, we don't believe that that is the right approach to complex problems that are layered onto complex environments. And so what we want to do is to share the research, share best practices, knowledge, and perspectives that we've learned over the past 8 years. And we also want people to engage with the material themselves and to engage in critical thinking and reflection and arrive at their own best practices within their own context. And so we hope that the case method is going to be one way that they can do that they can engage, we can engage in critical thinking and critical reflection so that communities can adopt and then adapt and apply the principles and the other perspectives that they see in the book or in the handbook or whatever it is that we end up titling our work, inshallah. So those are my thoughts on one tool that we are developing and that we're, as I said, we're pretty deep in right at the moment. And we are looking forward to continuing our learning and continuing the cycle of, learning and digesting and then feedback. And I think a big part of that is engaging with all of you today. So looking forward to our discussion.